Welcome everyone to Managing Uncertainty in Digital Projects. This is a Think Company webinar. Let me just get to the next screen. If you're not familiar with Think Company, we are an experienced design and technology consulting firm based in Philadelphia. We have another office over in Denver. And we've been around for about 13 years, working on all different kinds of digital experience projects with clients large and small. And we started this webinar series at the beginning of the pandemic when a bunch of our thinkers who had scheduled who had gotten accepted into South by Southwest actually couldn't deliver their South by Southwest talks. And we said, let's find a way that we can put these things online. We got a lot of great feedback on those, and we decided to just create a longer series of webinars. And so this is a great topic that has come up recently, and folks from our operations and client engagement teams are going to be talking about that. So speaking about webinars, just a few things just to cover on other upcoming things that we have going on at Think Company. If you are an organization that works in social justice, or actually for any organization that, if you know of any of these organizations, or if you also know any organizations that are sort of frontline folks in the world of this pandemic, we are offering free problem-solving workshops. We've done quite a few of them. We've gotten a lot of good feedback from the organizations that we're working with. It's just one of the things that we're trying to do to give back and try to address some of the issues that are coming up. So if you want to go to our website, there's right at thinkcompany.com, you'll see a banner that explains how you can sign up and give us some information about those. We do have some upcoming talks. So David Dillon Thomas, who is our content strategy advocate, is going to be speaking at the Design and Content Conference. He's going to be talking about fighting bias with content strategy. This coincides really well with the launch of his book, which is coming up very soon, which is designed for cognitive bias. So this is a new talk that he has around fighting bias using content strategy techniques. And you can register for that talk at content.design, and that's on July 15th. We have our next upcoming webinar for Think Company is How Fast is Fast? John Young, another engaging speaker from Think Company. He's done this talk in the past. And on July 16th, he'll be doing this. It's a really interesting topic. I think he's going to be changing it up a little bit from the last time he talked, just based on some of the feedback and some of the feedback and questions that came up during that talk. So that'll be an exciting upcoming webinar. And of course, you can always follow us on social media and keep an eye on our website. We have a new events page, and you can see when upcoming talks are coming. So just a few ground rules about this webinar so everyone knows and understands. You are all muted by default. That's the way Zoom's webinar platform works. The panel is going to be talking from basically around the minute that I shut up all the way up to about 3:45. And then we're going to take live Q&A about that point. And we can go as long as 4:30. I know the promotional materials for the webinar says we'll stop at 4. A lot of people need to drop off at 4, but we've had some pretty robust discussions in the past. So if we want to stick around until 4:30, everyone on our panel is free until then. If you have questions that you want to post throughout the webinar, then please post them in the Q&A feature. You'll see that at the bottom of your screen. You can just open that up and post a question. And even if you don't have a question, keep an eye on that feature because people's questions can be upvoted, and we'll try to prioritize them basically as the crowd chooses. So I'll be monitoring Q&A. I'll also be monitoring the chat session, and I'll come back into the webinar once the panel is done and help moderate the Q&A session at the end. If we select the question that you post, we'd love for it to be more conversational than us just reading your question out loud. So I'll try to unmute you and introduce you, and you can ask the question and maybe have some follow-up discussion with the panel. If you don't want to be featured or speak, you can always post your question anonymously in chat, and that'll be a cue for me to ask the question verbally for you. And if you don't feel like talking, just don't say anything when I unmute you, and then I'll repeat your question. We may not be able to get to all the questions. That's why we go to 4:30, but there have been a couple of times we haven't been able to answer all the questions. And we have folks who are moderating in chat and Q&A. So please feel free to engage us over there for any questions about Think Company, or some people end up with tech support questions and things like that. So you can go into the chat feature over there and chat with us about that. But if you have a question for the panel, please post it in Q&A because that's where we're going to be running the questions off of. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce the panel. Elina is going to be moderating the panel, so I'll introduce her first, and she can take it from there. Elina is Vice President of the Project Management Office at Think Company. She focuses on setting, oh wow, I've got a Zoom thing in the way of my notes. She focuses on setting the project management techniques with the knowledge, processes, and tools and that they need to ensure all of our projects, no matter how complex, are delivered on time. So Elina, I'm going to hand it over to you, and I'm going to hide my video, and it'll be great to have everyone on the panel.
Thank you, Phil. Great intro. So what a time to be talking about uncertainty, right? It feels like every day we wake up and there is a new challenge, new waters to chart, and new variables to consider. Today, we'll talk about how both global changes and everyday risks can impact our work and our teams. So first, we'll talk about the importance of considering whether our digital solutions are solving the right problems to begin with. I think we can all agree that now more than ever, a digital presence is vital to the success of an organization. But wondering whether we're moving in the right direction or if we should pivot is frequently a point of uncertainty. Then once things get started, it's common to feel ambiguous around progress made and uncertain if the work is being managed effectively. Essentially, are we on scope, on budget, and on time? Our panel of Think's key project, client, and operations leads will share strategies for how they've been able to navigate the uncertainties within their roles as they apply to the digital space. And with that, I'd love to introduce our panel. Jess, can you share with the group the role you play at Think and how you support our project teams?
Sure, thanks, Elina. My name is Jessica Victor, and I'm both a senior PM on active client work, and I'm also a people manager. And my focus is on ensuring project delivery excellence and passing that knowledge onto our growing PM team.
Jen?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Couchoud. I'm a Vice President of Client Engagement Management at Think Company, and my role is really to ensure that our customers have a good experience working with us so that they want to continue working with us in the future.
And Bruce.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Bruce McMahon, Chief Operations Officer here at Think. My job basically is to oversee the management of all Think Company's delivery and admin resources to ensure that the company is achieving its goals with the utmost efficiency.
Perfect. All right, so where does uncertainty begin? Maybe we've identified an issue or an opportunity. We're revamping a legacy system or building a product from scratch. And we've gotten as far as developing a budget and getting buy-in from stakeholders. So Jess, what is the first step in alleviating uncertainty around addressing a new challenge?
So regardless of the type of the project that you work on, I feel that the first step in managing this type of uncertainty is setting yourself up for success from the very beginning. The more clarity and mutual understanding you can build with your team and the client team that you're working with at the beginning of the project, the better basically everything will be in the long run. Kind of having that foundational layer is critically important. Something that we like to do is always do these types of kickoff meetings very collaboratively with our clients. So you get buy-in from both sides. It also helps you to build a lot of early team cohesiveness, which is really important and something you can bank on and build on later. And one of our key activities is building a purpose statement with our clients to make sure that we all know kind of what is our North Star for a project. It's something you can refer back to later to make sure that you're on track. Sometimes that can of course change, but it's always really important to have that kind of like first key step, assuring that like everyone is aligned. Obviously you also have to align on other things such as like your scope, schedule, and the budget, but it's important to note in that kickoff meeting what success looks like, what outcomes will satisfy both parties, things that are fixed, things that might be flexible, basically ensuring that everybody is really clear from the beginning, as many questions as possible have been answering. And then of course, as project manager, I have to say, documenting all of this stuff so you can refer back to it later.
Awesome. What have you seen happen when we don't take enough time to kick off, or maybe we don't take the time to set the goals or write the purpose statement?
That's when a lot of ambiguity can leak into your projects, and you might feel like you're on track, and then you realize you're kind of like 2 months in and someone's like, oh, I wasn't expecting us to go in this direction. And you're like, well, this is how I was feeling. And it's kind of just based on what people were maybe thinking at the time versus like a shared vision statement or like a document to rely on. So that's kind of when trouble and uncertainty can come in.
Yeah, I agree. From a tactical perspective, are there any specific documents? What are kind of some of the outputs from these early kickoff sessions?
Sure. So along with things like your purpose statement and a project plan, and having those things, we sometimes may also make like stakeholder maps, or building in what would go into a sprint zero type of a thing, which is all of a kind of time for just setup and creating these things. A stakeholder map might show when different key stakeholders or users might use part of an app, kind of really drilling down into some of those things. And those types of documents you can use and refer to later.
Cool, thanks. Thanks, Jess. So we have a goal and now we need people to help us achieve it. Bruce, as someone who has built many teams over the years, could the staffing of a team introduce more uncertainty to a project? What role does the team structure play in reducing overall project risk?
So obviously you need individuals who are proficient in the work that needs to be done. And I think oftentimes people are tempted to try and save costs by pulling together a team of Jacks and Jills of all trades. But if you do that, you'll suffer from a lack of efficiency. You'll want a team composed of mostly specialists to ensure that your estimates are accurate, that your work is done efficiently, that unexpected issues are addressed swiftly, and that'll give you more time to deal with uncertainty and surprises within your project. In addition to that, you can't ignore the personalities of the team. You want to, if you can, find a team that's capable of and comfortable working together. Ideally a team that has worked together in the past, has a proven track record. You need to make sure that there's somebody in a position that can identify if there are internal team issues, people that might be reluctant to speak up, people that might be reluctant to ask for help. All these things will help you just get work done more quickly, which again, frees up time and space to deal with uncertainty within your project. You don't want to rely on just hoping that a group of smart individuals coming together will be successful.
Right. Taking that one step further, so we know skill set is important, chemistry. We need a team of folks who are able to code when we need to code, research, design as according to the plans of the work. So we have a team of incredibly skilled and capable individuals at this point. What happens when decisions need to be made to see progress? Where does the team hierarchy fit in?
Yeah, well, I think it's a misconception that just having a team of high performers will guarantee success. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Every great pro sports team has a coach, right? And somebody has to be in charge. So, oftentimes within a project, when these surprises pop up, there's multiple ways to solve these problems. But you need to make a decision quickly and select a path. It's unavoidable, I think, especially with high performers. Egos may get in the way of those timely decisions. So you need to make sure, and typically, internally it would be a project manager, but with a client side team, it could be a product owner. Somebody has to be the person whose job it is to be in charge. So there has to be some sort of hierarchy on your team, without a doubt.
Do you have any thoughts around like activities that could lead teams to developing that hierarchy? Like if it doesn't exist naturally with titles or something like that?
Well, in the past, there's various tools you can use. If you want to get on the tool route, there's things like RACI diagrams, which are visual representation of the various different activities that may occur and ways to identify who is responsible for each activity. And if you go through that exercise, well, then there is no question, right? Whoever has the R, whoever's in the R column, that's the person responsible for that piece of the work. I've seen teams just kind of get together and say, look, I will be the lead of the sprint, or I will be in charge of this, depending on what the project is and what the team makeup is. You can have folks volunteer for that type of role and have everyone else acknowledge and accept it. So I don't know that there's one way of doing it. More often than not, the team structure, the titles will kind of dictate that, though. In our organization, for example, it's pretty well established that design leads own design decisions. Technical leads own technical decisions. Project management is kind of a connective tissue across everything. And if there's a conflict, they will help guide the team to a resolution quickly.
Right. And really quick, just for those who don't know, RACI. So does someone want to? So a RACI, I'll talk about it, is a matrix. R stands for responsible. A for, this is, sometimes there's disagreement about this, but A is accountable, C is consulted, and I is informed. So you list all of your activities on the Y axis, all of the RACI on the X axis, and then you assign who's responsible and accountable for each one of the activities. So that's like a good structured way to define the roles on the team if they're not clear when you start. Okay. So that's the team. So we're talking about all of this from the lens of a consultant. So partnering with stakeholders at an organization, that's something that we do. So we bring our team in to help solve the challenges at hand. But Jen, when thinking about the holistic team or the greater we, who is truly the key in that equation?
Sure. Well, I think if you think of a RACI, the true R in a RACI is the stakeholder, right? Your client, your stakeholder. Can kind of argue they're the most critical team member. Without them, of course, there's no project to begin with. And I say that not just talking about vendor-client relationships, but also internal projects. Pretty much every engagement you're going to work on has some main stakeholder. And they really have a lot of influence on how much ambiguity or risk is in a project. They have a lot of effect on that. So I can think of 3 different ways off the top of my head that comes into play. One is, the main stakeholders' time commitment and availability to the team and to the project itself, how engaged they are in the actual work, and then also how versed they are in their organization's decision-making process and the decision-making hierarchy that's involved in the engagement. So we're talking about time. It's not always within someone's control, but it's really important as a stakeholder and as you're setting the stage for the stakeholder for them to understand what time commitment is really needed from them. And I think that can happen in a lot of the ceremonies Jess talked about, in the beginning of a project where you're setting a kickoff and sort of talk a lot, make sure everyone's on the same page about both the amount of time and the critical points within the project where you're going to definitely need their time. And then also trying to understand what else is on their plate, what else is going on in that organization that's going to come into play and possibly introduce some risk or uncertainty into your timeline. Also, with that, not just the time commitment, but the sort of how engaged are they with the work. I know I have examples of, I worked on a project in the past where every deliverable, every interaction with the stakeholder, everything was great. Very little comment, very little to say about what we were showing. And instead of the team really thinking like, hey, really nailing this every time we talk to this woman, it was more a red flag to us that this stakeholder was not engaged. They were not necessarily having the space or time or, what have you to dedicate to critically looking at what we were showing, which introduces risk in that they could come back later, which this did happen, come back later and realize that they missed something that we now have to rework. Or, I think in the case of that project, she showed her higher up and realized, oh, there's something we're missing, that her stakeholder had feedback that then introduced risk and caused us to rework, which is expensive and costly to the project. And sort of related to that idea of like her stakeholder is the idea of decision-making in the organization. So we make a joke in the industry about clients coming in and, we often say it from the perspective of like a client coming in, and we call it like swooping in, like swooping and pooping on the project, right? Like swooping in and making a change that's going to blow up what you worked on. But really that, we joke about that, but that can apply to anyone. That can be a stakeholder. It can be your manager, right? It can be your department lead coming in and suggesting a change. So I think that it's a joke, but it's also something that's real and you can get ahead of it there are ways to get ahead of it. And that's really understanding who are the true decision makers. Is there an executive that's going to have to weigh in? Is there a compliance review or a legal team, or maybe even like the IT team can totally blow up your designs, right? So understanding who all the decision makers are is a key way to alleviate risk, and that can really be informed by having a good understanding of that through your stakeholder on an engagement.
Can you tie that to the stakeholder map? Because I saw some questions coming in, but I think maybe now is a good time to connect swooping and pooping, decision making, and where that stakeholder map could really help.
Yeah, stakeholder map is something we do a lot at Think Company on, especially when we're getting to know, maybe working with a new organization. So a stakeholder map you can put your either end product in the middle of that stakeholder map, or your client or your users in the middle of the stakeholder map. And what you do is you build around it all the people that touch that product or that end user, and concentrically building out, right? The further and further away they get from it. What it shows you as you both do that and then connect the people together is all the influence that happens to that product or that website or that end user. And it helps you see like this connection that could be far out, but matters, right? Like how they're connected, and that, okay, well, we really need to consult that group before we make this decision and call it final. So I do think a stakeholder map, it's helpful in a lot. It really reveals a lot, but it is helpful in decision making and sort of understanding who all is involved. There's also something called a process map that we do sometimes, which is similar, but looking at the process. What is the current process of decision making, and mapping that out visually is also a really helpful tool.
Awesome. Thanks, Jess. Or Jen. Jess, you manage projects every day and are coordinating between our internal teams and the client teams. We know risk is introduced when expectations are not aligned. How do you keep everyone informed and on the same page?
Sure. So in every project, also when you're setting things up, you'll have set up some type of communication plan between, also including like internal communications and ones that are going out to clients. At least like a once a week meeting with their clients, more meetings internally. So it's important to get that set up from the beginning and ensuring that everyone is adhering to it. We also usually love in-person meetings when we're able to all go out and do that, not these times, of course. But it's important to know in those meetings, like knowing your audience. That's like the number one thing about getting information across and helping reducing uncertainty. You need to know who you're talking to, the type of information that they need to know, and kind of how they're going to digest it. Some people, maybe an executive stakeholder who's just checking on this project every now and then, just really wants like the super high level, like are we on budget, are we on time, like the end. They don't really care about the weeds and the details. But maybe your main day-to-day contact wants to literally know, how many tickets did you close? How many wireframes have you made? Like kind of all that nitty-gritty information. So it's important to not overwhelm people with details when they don't want it, because it's not going to help them. They probably won't read anything, but to make sure that people who do need it, need that stuff. And so even some things we do is like a quick traffic light, like a red, yellow, green of like, how is your budget? And that even that color could catch someone's eye and spark them to be like, hey, I thought this was on track. Like, why did you mark it as a yellow? It might seem obvious, but that kind of stuff can start conversations. And the other thing is it's important to know how people want information. Sometimes I will like send something to clients beforehand so they can like spend some time like thinking about it, digesting it. And then when we get into the meeting, we can have a better, more informed discussion about it versus like, well, we need to review 10 bullet points of information before we can come to a decision, and we end up leaving the meeting kind of without a decision. So it's a little bit of a careful balance and checking in on how those processes are going and knowing that you can change them. Just because you always have meetings at Wednesday at 2 o'clock doesn't mean that 3 months from now, that that's still a good time for everybody.
Awesome. Yeah, one of my favorite quotes that I carry with me always is by Mark Twain. And it says, I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long one. And that one really resonates, especially in the project management world where you're constantly juggling many details and you want to bestow them upon everyone. That's maybe not always the best way to go about it.
Sure. Yeah. Above all, you just need to make sure that the communication is effective, however it's happening, whether someone's better on the phone, better in email, if they need it on the phone and then in a documented follow-up. You just really need to know and focus on like, what is that like one thing? Like you're writing someone an email, what if they read one sentence of my email, what does this need to be?
Right. So we've talked quite a bit about the initiation activities of a project. So we consider that setting the goals, putting together the right team, and the communication plan. So what about planning the work itself? Bruce, what can be done from a planning perspective to help manage the uncertainty for both our internal teams and the client stakeholders?
Yeah, plan. Yeah, so you just mentioned a quote. So early in my career, I came across a quote by Leonard Bernstein. It goes, to achieve great things, two things are needed: a plan and not quite enough time. And it resonated with me back during the dot-com boom, because we were asked to just accomplish very great, these awesome new technological things under tight timelines and tight budgets and these difficult constraints with new technologies. If you don't have a plan, there's no way you can hope to succeed. It's just no doubt about it. There's no way you can evaluate your progress. There's no way of knowing when you're going off track, knowing when to adjust or pivot. From an uncertainty perspective, for managing uncertainty, you have to be sure to create a plan that accomplishes your goal, but leave room in your plan to accommodate the unknown. So if you need to be done by the end of the year, create your first plan that shows you being done by Thanksgiving, or if your budget's $500,000, allocate $300,000, leave yourself some reserve. Really the less that you know about the project details up front, the more contingency you should add into the plan. Sometimes it's not uncommon to see, especially in tech projects, 25 or 50% contingency, just based on the lack of knowledge around the detailed requirements. And that'll help you mitigate to a certain extent the uncertainty around, accomplishing your goals. Oftentimes people, I think, are reluctant to start planning because we don't have all the information yet, and that's okay. Your first plan can be vague. It's okay. Here's discovery will be the first 3 weeks. Design will be the next 4 weeks, whatever. And you can start at those very kind of low level of fidelity and work your way down as new facts are known. A key point, an important thing to commit to is just making sure you update your plan anytime new facts are known. Don't fall behind on your plan. Adjust your plan constantly as you gaining knowledge around your project. I think it's really important in the spirit of coming to timely decision making. The upfront, everyone has to be comfortable with the fact that the plan will change. It's okay. Plans change. For us, plans often change at the kickoff meeting. It's okay. And if people are comfortable with knowing that up front, then they won't be so reluctant to accept the change, and they'll be quicker to make decisions around the best path forward for accepting that change. You can't. I talked before about the team structure, all that kind of stuff. You can't just assume that you'll put together a strong team, a bunch of smart people, or hire a great vendor, and that I hope they figure it out. Hope is not a plan. You must make sure that there is a plan presented to you that accomplishes your goal, and that it's a realistic plan. The one last point I'd like to talk about when it comes to planning too, a lot of the times we talk about plans, we think about timelines, and planning is not just a timeline or a Gantt chart. For us, a good plan should include agreed upon approaches for managing our communication, for gathering feedback, evaluating progress, tracking your risk, your budgets, managing team resources, accounting for holidays and vacations, the stakeholder matrix that we talked about, all that kind of stuff, RACI diagrams, everything that start planning around that. And I'll give you more headspace and room to accommodate the unknowns and the uncertainty.
Yeah. One thing you didn't say today, but you've said many a time, and I think the rest of us can attest, is some data is better than no data, right? Mm-hmm. Just start with somewhere, better than nowhere.
Yeah.
So we've talked about it earlier. Uncertainty introduces serious risk to any engagement. Jen, what are some risk mitigation strategies that you've seen to be successful?
Sure. I think that there are both really formal risk mitigation tactics and informal ones. An informal one that I've had a lot of success with is soliciting a lot of feedback. I'm speaking mostly about client feedback, but this also works from the team perspective. But I find that having one-on-one discussions with your stakeholder outside of your regularly scheduled meeting. So outside of a deliverable review or a team meeting, gives a chance to ask for this feedback, you know, ask questions like, is there anything you wish was different? Is there any feedback you have for the team? Anything you want to see them do differently? Often in these conversations, I hear back things that are maybe, you know, a course correction for the team, something that they would like the stakeholder would never escalate to me or to the leads on the team, but things that we can correct that would make the experience working with us better. And also, you know, I think that when we do that, we're course correcting little course corrections along the way, you're really avoiding the chance that these little things can add up to one big unhappy experience working with us in the end. So I think soliciting that feedback is an informal way of mitigating risk. Some more formal ways of doing it are things like pre-mortems, which you might do at, you know, a kickoff or at a retrospective, you know, an early retrospective. So at a pre-mortem, you're imagining what are all the things that can go wrong on this project. So, and then coming up with ways to mitigate those things. So you might do something like a sailboat exercise, if anyone's done that before, which is where you're identifying if the project was a sailboat, what are the factors that are the wind at your sails, you know, making you go faster? What are the anchors that are going to slow you down? And what are rocks in the water that could really just derail the journey? So you can do formal exercises like that. Often the results of those exercises are like a risk matrix where you're saying this is the risk and this is the mitigation strategy for that risk. So those are some formal ways to try and mitigate risk. There's also things like midpoint retrospectives. So, you know, don't wait till the end of the project to get feedback from the team on how things are going. Do them, you know, along the way, especially if you have a long engagement. I think that those are some sort of formal things that in ceremonies that you can do to help alleviate risk along the way of a project.
What's a way to combat client and internal team amnesia, so to speak?
Sure. Yeah, that happens. We all get amnesia. Our clients get amnesia. We get amnesia as a team. We forget why we made a decision. Why did we leave that button off? Why did we leave that out of the navigation? So to me, the easiest answer to that is documentation. So I know that there's some allergy to documentation sometimes in, you know, an agile environment. There can be adverse reaction to documentation, but I think it can be simple. It doesn't have to be complex and burdensome, but I think it's important to document things maybe in a decision log. You know, we like to keep a decision log on our projects to sort of keep track of those big decisions. Why did we make changes along the way? What was feedback that we got that we implemented? Just so that, you know, we have that to fall back on when someone might develop amnesia or, you know, an executive asks a question and we have to remember why did we do that? So this definitely happens a lot on projects.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds just like overall rigor around many different things is really helpful. So Jess, you've heard it from clients before. Are we on track? So are we? How do you keep the team on track and soothe clients' worry about progress?
Sure. So progress on a project, from my perspective, it can happen in a few different ways. Can be progress or not from your scope, your timeline, your budget. And in an ideal world, you've got that perfect triangle and like everything is like perfectly on track. So you can be like ahead in some areas and behind in some areas. So the easiest way, or a way that we tend to manage that, is like honestly having good project plans and good tools that you use a lot, you update frequently, you look at, and it just becomes like a core part of your project. As a PM, I eat, sleep, and breathe in my project plans. I'm always looking at them, and I make sure that not only my clients have access, that my teams have access to them. So there's kind of like no surprises. That's what we're always going for, is that everyone knows is what's coming up next on these projects. For example, on some agile projects, we obviously might work in jira, where people are working in tickets and in design sprints. So there's frequent meetings to talk about these things when you're working for agile ceremonies, and you can actually literally see tickets moving across the board, a bit of a visual indicator of how well are you doing, or like a quick gut check on something like that. We also at Think do our project plans in Team Gantt, which is a really actually just very nice looking project planning tool. It marks things by colors. It can show the progress and things like that. So I'm constantly keeping those up to date and reviewing them with my team. But the most important thing is having good data, because if your tools are full of useless or old data, they're not going to tell you anything. So I think it's important to just constantly be talking about that. On a weekly progress, we share these plans with our clients so they know what's coming up, and ensuring that the data is as sound as possible.
Good data, it's important.
Mm-hmm.
You may have experienced team members not wanting to update Jira. How do you combat that, or how do you promote those behaviors?
Sure. So developers are usually a little bit better using Jira. Maybe not better, but more acclimated to it. And so honestly, to combat people not updating Jira, I just make it part of my stand-ups or my meetings that I have with my team. I might shoot them a quick message on Slack, like, hey, our meeting's in 2 minutes. Is Jira up to date? Because we're going to talk about it. So I'm not afraid to use a little bit of maybe social pressure, or then we're going to be like, well, we're going to watch you update Jira just as part of this meeting. And once it just becomes part of the regular cadence, people do it. I don't mind sometimes having to send those little updates to folks. And usually people kind of like come around because we kind of see it as like a team effort to keep everything up to date. And I've also done design sprints in Jira. They recently revamped their UI and they have some really nice road mapping features. And so it's kind of then really nice where the team comes together and you've got your design team and your development team all working in the same tool. And it just feels really nice where everyone can see kind of like everyone's work from a high level perspective.
Yes, I agree. So have you ever experienced like a time where one person is on multiple projects? Like how do you make sure that we can progress on your project? Like where does the resourcing come in?
So that's when you get together with your fellow PMs, and we have a document that has everyone's hours and stuff because we do share team members, and it's honestly open communication with other project managers with knowing what's going on in their projects. And sometimes it's like, hey, we've got this really big deliverable coming up. Is it possible to, can we borrow this certain developer for this time? And it's just a bit of a give and take. And it usually, hopefully, you can see these things coming in advance. Like, okay, in like 3 or 4 weeks, I will need someone. So you're not kind of like begging to have time that week. And that's an ideal space. And so luckily, I think everyone's pretty good about sharing resources with each other. And on the chance that they're not, sometimes you need to just look at your team and can someone else on your team handle it? Or then if none of those options are possible, you have to go back to your client and explain why something might be happening. You might have to push out like a deadline date or something like that, kind of in the most extreme case.
Great. Well, speaking of progress, nothing stops progress like a stalemate between executive stakeholders. Someone wants focus on feature A, another on feature B. Jen, how do you handle differing opinions and finding the consensus needed to unblock the team?
That definitely is something that happens. We talked about strong leadership, we talked about stakeholder mapping, and I think that in some ways, if it can be as simple as understanding who is the true decision, who truly does make that decision between A and B, who has the sort of hierarchical ability to make that, strong leadership in the organization's part can sometimes break a stalemate. It's not always possible or available, or sometimes you need to help your stakeholder, campaign for their choice. And in that case, it can help to fall back on some of the materials that we talked about earlier, like a purpose statement or an objective matrix. So if we've identified early on what the purpose of the endeavor was, what the objectives we're trying to meet, then maybe either option A or option B more closely meets those objectives, which makes for a pretty convincing argument about which one of those things can win. Also, sometimes you can work towards maybe everybody getting a little bit of what they want. If it's possible to do both options, maybe one now, maybe one in a later release, depending on what the decision is. Also, we like to a lot rely on evidence-based design. So we do a lot of research on our projects and with our end users. And so evoking the end user's best option is often a good neutral way to break a stalemate. You know, what do the users want, and rely on the research. And I think that's why it's important to do that research and have that evidence. Like, all of our design decisions are made with the user in mind. And that's very helpful when you have people who are maybe disagreeing or have opinions, but maybe they're just opinions not really rooted in research. It's usually the opinion or choice that's rooted in research tends to win.
Great. So we're heading to the end of this. So as we wrap today, it's important that progress doesn't end with us or our individual efforts. Bruce, with your position focusing on the overall health of operations across the company, how do you get ahead and proactively reduce uncertainty for your teams?
Well, there's no way to prevent it totally, right? But you know, you try to use your lessons learned, and like Jess has said and Jen has said, you know, documentation is very important. Write down anything you can that's relevant to the project, successes and failures, so that others can learn from your mistakes. But you know, the documentation is really only good if people know where to find it and if they're asked to look at it. So you know, establishing a central repository within an organization has been a big step towards that. Here at Think, we use Confluence, but there's other platforms out there. But regardless, like having even a folder on your network with just, you know, post-mortem documents of projects would be better than nothing. And then, you know, trying to get into some sort of ritual of having other teams review the documents. You know, Team A had a project that concluded, Team B should read their documentation, find out, you know, what are the parallels, what lessons were learned. Having, you know, the management team kind of encourage and sometimes, you know, require individuals to share cross-project knowledge is super important. You know, we have various ways of doing it at Think, you know, with things we call dig meetings and cross-departmental dig meetings and quarterly review of project status. All these things are meant to help us educate each other on project failures, project successes, new best practices, you know, new tools. So that is very important. I think the other piece that will help is also having a process to evaluate your team's performance. You know, in the very beginning, I mentioned, you know, the how great it is to have a team that has a successful track record, you know, that has worked together in the past. And well, the only way you can evaluate that is if you look to evaluate that. So having a process to determine, you know, did every team member meet the expectations of their role? You know, if not, why did that happen? You know, and be honest with yourselves about that. You know, sometimes it's the product owner. The product owner missed half the stand-ups or whatever. You know, like, you know, you have to be committed to fixing mistakes you identify.
Can you talk a little bit about how the documentation of our best practices and just overall documentation that we've put together affects new team members and onboarding?
Yeah, I mean, depending on the team member and their level of seniority, it affects them greatly, right? So at the very least, it establishes credibility, right? Like we hear time and time again, folks come into our organization and they're like, wow, you have so much process, so much good stuff written down. You know, and these are all best practices learned from trial and error. You know, sometimes I giggle and say, yeah, it wasn't always like that. You know, but everything as much as like our onboarding documentation to our project setup documentation, all these things are put in place to help increase efficiency. And again, you know, you can't eliminate uncertainty, but what you can do is free yourself more time to help handle the uncertainty, help handle the surprises that pop up. You know, it also makes it easier. Look, it's impossible to have 100% retention on any project, any team as well. So if you have things documented, if you have established processes and everybody's working, kind of marching to the same beat, and that's written down and people are trained on that, well, then you're also reducing risk, which helps you manage the uncertainty of whether it's adding new team members, swapping team members, starting new projects. So there's no reason, I can't think of any reason that documenting things doesn't help.
Well, that was everything that we had. I would love to give it back to Phil or whoever and answer some questions. I see some red bubbles. Let's clear them.
Yeah, A couple of notes before I dive into the questions. First of all, this is the first webinar we've done where questions came so quickly. So that's just awesome. I think you're surfacing some great ideas, and there's a lot of conversation going on in the chat and Q&A channel about that. And just for everyone to know, if we go beyond 4 o'clock, we have a sort of a back channel in Slack that we use to manage some of the back of the house stuff we're doing in these webinars. And there's already conversations around supplementing the email that's going to come out with some links and other additional content, just as a refresher for folks. So that email goes out to anyone who's on the webinar list, whether you've attended or not, or whether you leave early or not. So that'll be there. Suzanne's also going to post some links to some other information right before 4 o'clock. So if we do go over, just make sure you pop into the chat channel and follow up on some of that kind of stuff. But I want to get to the questions. So I think that Mirna actually has posted more questions than anyone else in the Q&A channel. So Mirna, I'm going to try and unmute you and see if you can ask. Let's talk about the first one of transitioning from active to passive communication, and then if we can get back to your other questions, then we'll bring you back on. But give me 1 second to unmute you. Okay, if you want to ask your question, I think you're on live now.
Yeah, sure. Hello, guys. Let me introduce myself. This is Mirna from Lebanon. I'm a project manager in a digital company. We're working mainly on SaaS product. We don't have a client. We have our own product. We are currently moving from the methodology approach to be more agile, to be more flexible, and to adapt easily. So I have some obstacles that I'm facing sometimes with my team, that they usually prefer to have meetings to discuss the ideas, not over Slack or Asana or anything passive. But I think since after Corona, we used to work, we have to work from home, and apparently this will become permanently. So I want to manage the things and to let the team to talk more, to manage some task or some issue passively, and then if something is not understandable, we can have a meeting, but not every time to have a meeting. So this is my first question.
Yeah, so I think the question is really about how do you get your team to really comply with sort of getting them out of everything has to be in a meeting mode.
Okay, I'm trying my best to, I'm having a channel for my project, and I tend to follow up with the team member every day on the project, and I'm using also Asana for project management to follow up on the task. But sometimes because they are used to have meetings a lot, I'm finding an obstacle just to transition this issue to passive communication.
Yeah, so Jess, Bruce, Elina, Jen, do you have any advice for Mirna?
I have some thoughts. Without knowing the intimate details of the team or the project. I mean, earlier when we talked about team chemistry, and if your team and your project requires confident decision makers, you got to ask yourself: are your team members confident decision makers? Are they able to make decisions on their own, or are they afraid of making decisions? Therefore, they feel comfort in doing like group decision making. So I don't know. The other question I would ask myself here is like, what's the issue with having meetings? If the team's comfortable working that way, why are you looking to change that? Is it slowing down the progress, or?
To be honest, meetings sometimes they take too much time and they are time consuming. So we have a lot of tasks to do. I'm working on product level and on the PMO department. So sometimes meetings, they are time consuming, and the management, they took a decision to turn slightly to the passive communication.
And you're trying to deter people from doing the meetings and adopt this new approach.
Yeah, slightly, not directly. Yeah.
Have you thought of requiring individuals to provide an agenda before scheduling a meeting?
I'm trying to send also the agenda prior to the meeting, but they are not used to do it. That's why they are let's say it, people are resist to change. So if you want to introduce anything new, so they will resist. So I'm trying to push it harder, but I'm still facing some obstacles.
One other thing. I say along with setting agendas like beforehand, which is really helpful, then sometimes people are like, oh, maybe I can just answer this really quickly in Slack, is trying to, if possible, and notice another change, like setting specific times of your day that's like, this is the time for meetings and like, this is the time for heads down work, to at least then you know you have like a good time to get your work done, and like meetings will be in the morning or in the afternoon or whatever works better for your team. And then try to make that, you know, like a small block of time and be like, were we okay before we had this meeting? Like, yes, because we were getting work done and we were also communicating, you know, but outside of this time, try to make them like a specific time so at least the team knows when they're coming.
As you said, also it will take some time, but I like what Bruce talk about the confidence of the team. Maybe we have a problem on this level, so I should work on it more.
Yeah, I mean, that's, you know, or I forget which question I was answering, but I talked about having somebody in a position to like evaluate the performance of the team. Are they, you know, doing what's expected of them? And you know, if the expectation is that they are now required to make more decisions on their own, well, you got to be honest with yourself. Are they capable and able to do that?
You're right.
And also, does the culture of your organization support that? You know, like if you have an organization that doesn't support making, you know, if someone makes a bad decision and they're castigated for it in front of everyone else, then that's a different thing. Whereas if somebody makes a mistake or a bad decision and you say, all right, well, let's debrief that and move on. That's the kind of environment that I think encourages that kind of behavior more.
Yeah, you're right. So we have this problem.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, I'm gonna move to. We're probably gonna get back to you, Myrna, because you did post a whole bunch of questions. But let me jump to the next question, and actually this is related to yours as well. So I'm gonna mute Myrna, and I'm gonna I think I'm gonna bring Lamar up. If Lamar is still with us, let me find him in the list. He is. So Lamar, you had a question about stakeholder maps. Myrna did as well, and I think we talked a little bit about it. But if you have any additional thoughts or questions, you're unmuted now.
Okay, hi. Yeah, this is Lamar. I work in a web consultancy in Philadelphia. And you did answer my question mostly. I'm really interested in the stakeholder map, and it actually kind of feeds into my second question, which is about just sort of client culture. And, you know, I really liked what you were saying about getting to know all the ways you were suggesting, getting to know just who your client, you know, who they're bringing to the table and the different power structures and personalities and all that's going on there. And I'm interested in, I think this does have to do with the stakeholder map as well as my second question, just about, you know, what if they don't have certain positions that you would deem essential, like a PM or like a PM that's designated to this project that we're working on, or, you know, how can we struggle with, how can we respect and adjust to their culture and their roles while still ensuring our own efficient process?
That's a great question. It's something that we run into all the time. Jen, you were nodding vigorously, so I wonder if you have thoughts about this.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a concise answer for it, but definitely something, you know, we run into that all the time. There is not always, like specifically your question about a project manager on the client side, that happens all the time. You know, there's often not a position in the organizations we work with. And we find ourselves kind of playing that role for the client at times. It's a way, you know, in one way, it's a way that we add value, you know, to our client teams. If they don't have the roles, they can often find that working, you know, maybe they've never worked with project managers before, they will soon find that, like, wow, we need project managers on their side. And it can be a way to sort of point out gaps that they can then fill on their side. But I do think, going back to your point about sort of understanding the dynamics, I think your question is like the kind of like getting to know your client's organization and the dynamics between the people you're working with. I do think stakeholder mapping is important, but there's some things that are just about maybe emotional intelligence that are kind of hard to pinpoint, right? I think, you know, an example I have is we've had a client in the past where you know, a meeting with that client can seem awkward, and then later, you know, it was like kind of an awkward interaction. They're quiet. You're like, oh, did they not like what we presented? You know, was it us? Is this bad feedback? And what we realized later was like, there's dynamics going on in that room that we don't understand. You know, later we understood like actually what's going on is a dynamic on the client side that we just didn't know. So I think it is important to try and understand, you know, what's going on in a client's organization. There's just, I don't know too many very quick ways to do that. It's usually conversations and observation as much as possible.
Yeah, well, and I loved your point of kind of the off the record, like walking down the hall check-in, because that's when, you know, if you do have somebody who's kind of going to be in your court and say, oh, you know, there was actually a silence going on, and, you know, people looking at each other in that question and nobody answered, and that's why, you know, that can just help a lot.
Yeah, and that can be hard with COVID, right? Like you don't have that opportunity anymore. That's sort of like walking back to the lobby to sign you out. But I have found just scheduling like 30 minutes with a client to chat, they're like way more receptive to that in the time of COVID than I thought they would be. So I think it's good to not assume that they don't have time because we're all remote now. It can actually be a nice little break to talk and to kind of like talk, just chat and like get that same kind of, you know, side conversation that you could get after a meeting in person before.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
That's awesome. Thank you for your question, Lamar. I'm gonna mute you 1 second, and I'm gonna jump to our next question. And the next question is anonymous, so I'll read it out. But it's from the anonymous intend to be, beyond good documentation, how can you ease transitions with different groups of people are involved in different parts of the process? For example, if there's an initial vetting brainstorming team, and once a project is approved, a subset of that group is part of the execution team, along with other people who are not part of any initial discussion. So I think this is all about like onboarding and handoffs. And I don't know if anyone has any tips or tricks on handling that and making that smoother on your teams.
Sure. So something we do on our projects, when you're on a project, typically, right, like you'll have to, like some research or design up front and development comes later. And developers understandably sometimes feel like left out. They're like, I wasn't in the beginning and this is kind of what I've been handed. So what we do is we always make sure that the leads from each of those departments are there throughout the entirety of the project. Even if we don't have, I had a project where we weren't getting to development for like the first 6 months of the project, but my development lead came to weekly meetings. They were in the client meetings so the client knew who they were. They could ask questions that would help influence the research and design and all sorts of things up front. So when we got to development, there weren't some of those like questions like, well, did we think through this? Did we think through that? He was able to bring his perspective to the table the whole time. And then when we got to development, he was also able to build like that client trust. Like, this is just some random person coming on the project. He's a known quantity, you know, engaged with him so far. And similarly, we'll keep like a design lead on the project in the development phase so they can, you know, give like visual QA and just do things like that. So we try to not silo teams to help with some of that transition. I mean, like, I don't want to say documentation because that is like a big part of it, and we really do a lot of that here. But I think just having that consistent team focus, even if it's not like the key part of the project that they're on, is really important.
I'll also add, can I just add one thing? There's some rigor with process that helps with this as well. Like if everyone is working in a clean way and there's consistency across multiple teams, like if your sketch files are set up a certain way every time, if your folder structure is set up a certain way so that when a new team comes in, they don't have to learn a brand new process. There's just some consistencies between the projects that they're working on. And that does help onboard, like their expectations are aligned between teams.
That's a great point, Elina. And I think, like, you know, just to wrap what you and Jess both said together into one thing, like you know, this notion that Bruce floated out there of having a known single repository for something, and we use Confluence, and that's kind of the place that you go to understand what's going on in the project. But then we have known repositories for, you know, whether it's GitHub or Abstract or wherever the materials that are being stored. Like and someone in the chat was talking about creating design systems for documentation. That's kind of what you're doing when you do this, that if everything is in a known place and it's following a known structure, then it's very easy to transition team members on and off, as opposed to doing it in any other way. So that's great. I know I'm not going to try to unmute Chris Larson. He asked the next question, but he also mentioned he had to drop in the chat. So I'm just going to read his question out loud. He says, positive relationships and trust are a big deal for project success, but the current totally virtual communication environment that we're in, what are some ways to build relationships among, for lack of a better word, strangers, and to set up trust among each other? What if chemistry isn't bubbling so well? So I think he's talking about, like, how do you get people to work together well, especially if they're strangers? And, you know, the codicil of this is, how do you do that in this current environment where we really can't gather together physically, even if we wanted to?
It's tough, right? It's definitely tougher, and I think we are all learning how to do this. So I don't want to come across as suggesting we know how to solve this problem. But one of the things that, you know, I think when you talk about like team dynamics, you know, communication is key, and written communication is important. But man, you lose so much tone, you lose emotion. Like I think having these Zoom calls, asking everybody to turn their cameras on when you can, because I think you need to see the body language. You need to see like the size of despair, or like the rolling of the eyes, or like whatever, to really understand like how people are truly feeling, and that'll help, I think, get people to at least understand each other better. It won't necessarily make them work better together, but at least, you know, it starts with understanding where the friction points are. So I would encourage video communication when you can, to try to replace like what would normally be like walking to somebody's desk and having the face-to-face conversation.
Yeah.
I'll also say that sometimes talking about things outside of the project and work-related things really help to build relationships. Like, we can see each other's backgrounds. People talk to me about my shelf all the time. Knowing what we're doing, each other is doing on the weekend, what our personal interests are. I know Bruce loves to bike. I can ask him about biking if I ever want to talk about something outside of work. I think that's always a great way to build relationships. Yeah.
Yeah. What other techniques, you know, if you think about the beginning of projects, have any of you used to sort of start to create bonds among your team members?
I'm gonna steal a suggestion from another project manager that she does so well. One of our PMs, while she's waiting for everyone to attend to a meeting, she'll have like just a video, like a live cam from a zoo about cute animals. And like, it always gets people talking, like, oh, look at this penguin, you know what I mean? And it's just such like a small thing, and it just sets with a tone of like, oh, this is gonna be, you know, like an entertaining thing. What's going on here? Let's talk about penguins. And then all of a sudden you realize like, oh, I guess we should talk about the project. You know what I mean? So it's just such a easy icebreaker because we're all alone, but everyone knows penguins, hopefully, you know what I mean? So just something like that. It's just those little things, and just making that like little chit chat, like for clients going on like PTO, be like, where are you going? What are you doing? Just like being engaged with them like you would in real life. It doesn't mean that they're just, you know, that aspect has to stop entirely.
Yeah, that's great. Mm-hmm. Well, why don't we move on to another question? I want to give someone else an opportunity to speak, so I'm going to scroll down to find a new name. I might get back to Lamar and Marina in a bit, but John Rodriguez asked a bunch of questions about RACI framework. So, John, I'm going to try to unmute you if you're still with us, and you should be unmuted now. So if you want to, did that work? Hold on, let me try this again. All right, John, you're on. If you feel like asking your question, you can unmute your thing.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, we got you.
Okay, cool. So yeah, introduction to myself. I'm John Rodriguez. I'm a recent UX graduate from Jefferson University. So lately I've been like evaluating about various frameworks and how they have changed in COVID. So I have like 2 questions on that. So y'all mentioned about, yeah, first of all, thanks for sharing all those insights, super helpful. I was wondering about the RACI framework y'all shared. Was that something that you all implemented before COVID, or something that you all implemented after COVID in order to keep track of the things the people are working on the team?
We use that framework to solve problems as they come up. So we've definitely used it in the past, and we'll put documentation in Confluence or a repository for those decisions. A lot of times it helps people know where to go when they have a question. So instead of asking every single person and scheduling a meeting. They can just look at that RACI and understand who's the decision maker about this topic. I'll just go to them. So that works from an operational level. Like, is it a project manager or your own manager that you should ask this question for? And then from a project level, you know, you can do it as well. So yes, use them whenever, COVID, non-COVID, remote, in person, always, but make sure you document it, write it down, and let people know where you have stored it.
Okay.
I'll say that
John, sorry.
Yeah. Sorry.
We love RACIs.
We love RACIs so much. We all want to talk about RACIs.
I was just going to add it. I think, John, you're asking like how long we've been using that tool, and it's been around forever. Like I think I first started using RACIs 15 years ago. Okay, so it's not a new concept. If that was your question.
Gotcha. Yeah, because the priority of like you know, using that more when the teams are like not actually there in a space. So that is what I was trying to get a sense of. But I think like that's the part of the process, and I can see that is like implemented in the project management process. Yeah. If you all don't mind, I have a second question. So again, it's the goal to understand the methods. So I've been reading a lot about Scrum, and something that I used in my previous projects and all that stuff, and running this design sprints along with this Scrum methods. Do you all like use that in your project or a workflow? So then like I'm trying to understand if you all are using it. So what are the good ways of using it now, doing it online? And if you all are not using it, why that process is not in effect? It's not an effective way of going about it now. So I'm just trying to understand that framework and how it is used now. Yeah.
I've seen some of our, you know, I work closely with a client who's fully agile, and I actually didn't see too much of an impact on the team going fully remote on the agile, like Scrum ceremonies that they were doing. They actually, I feel like, very easily adapt to a fully remote team. I think maybe in their conception was taking that in mind, that people could be co-located. So I think, at least in my experience so far, it hasn't, us all being remote, our clients all being remote, hasn't really affected our use of those methodologies too much. Actually, I think they're pretty similar to how we were using them before.
Okay, yeah, got it.
Yeah, just to chime in, I know I'm not on the panel, but I mean, I think the one challenge that really is out there is that, you know, team members who want to like run over by a whiteboard and start sketching something out, or again, stop by someone's desk and dealing with that, like that's not as easy now. But we also use tools like Miro, and you know, virtual whiteboarding tools and things like that help out in that sense. So I think our teams, it's funny, soon after the pandemic started, we started getting a lot of requests for licensing at the Think Company for software that we weren't using previously. And it was obviously worth the investment to allow folks to continue to collaborate remotely. So, and I think that's helped us.
Yeah, cool. Thank you for sharing the insights. Yeah.
Thank you, John.
No problem.
I'm going to go to, let's see. Got a bunch of anonymous questions here, and we have more from Mira. So actually, I'm going to go back to Mirna if she's still on, because this is a great question, I think, about revising your project plans. So I don't know if you want to ask it, Mirna.
Yeah, which question again?
The idea of drafting a preliminary plan and then adjusting as you move.
Sometimes we let me talk about my recent project. I got assigned to a new product, actually, which is definitely a new project, a new risk, and there's a lot of uncertainty. How, in your opinion, how can a project manager draft a primary plan and adjust it as we move on? How feasible it can be? He or she should wait from the team to get input on the design and technical and marketing, or the project manager can have a primary vision. Can anyone answer this question?
Yeah, I'll usually start with like the requirements at the beginning of a project, and I will make what I think is going to be our project plan, but I will certainly vet it with my like design and other team leads to make sure that it is reasonable and that it meets their expectations of how long things would take. We do a lot of repeatable things, so it's a little bit easier to be like, this usually takes this amount of time and stuff like that. So I would say my plan gets us most of the way there, the one that I've made, but then I will kind of like vet it with the team before I would show it to anyone external facing in particular. But your other comment, like we are constantly making like little updates to the plan all the time, depending on, you know, you got requirements late for a project or research is taking too long and you need to like put something out or like pull something in because something went faster. So I feel like they do change frequently in small ways. If you were having like a big change, that's probably signs that something went really wrong, or it'd be a project that requires like a change order because we're going to like pause and do something else. So I think a PM can certainly make most of it.
Yeah. You mean that the project manager can at least identify deliverables, milestone, etc.?
Totally.
Okay. All right.
Mirna, are you familiar with like t-shirt sizing exercises?
I didn't get you.
T-shirt sizing. It's a term. Okay, so I don't know how common the term is, but one of the things we do to kind of manage like, you know, vague requirements is typically with our projects there's an end date. You know, somebody wants to launch by some point in time, right? So let's say end of the year, and we know that there's a login page. We know that there's a search engine. We know that there's a product page with a product detail page, and you know, 3 different blog types and whatever. And but we don't know a lot more, right? So we size these things. Okay, well, this is small, this is medium, this is large, and kind of so you start with these very vague estimates that you kind of fit into a timeline, and you might know you have to identify what are your constants as well. Well, I only have 5 team members, so okay. So now that I have these sizes, and I know that a small is typically a week of work, a medium is typically, you know, a month of work, whatever. You can start kind of putting together a plan based on these really large blocks. It's kind of like building a structure out of, or using giant toddler-sized Lego blocks, or using the advanced small Lego blocks where you can get more detail, right? In the beginning, you're using those, what are those big toddler blocks called? I forget. But, you know, you're starting with what you know, and you have these big chunks of work. So, you know, I think it's important that you just try to plan around whatever you know, whatever facts you know. If your team is being asked to produce something, there has to be an end goal for what this thing does.
Okay.
You know?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Great. Well, thank you, Mirna. I'm gonna, oh man, I feel bad. I just cut her off while she was thanking us. I'm sorry, Mirna. That's terrible. I gotta get better at this. There's one question that an anonymous attendee asked that I think is a really good question to just throw out to the group here, but they want to know how many projects we're typically managing. One person's typically managing at once. And how do you keep up with all, if you're managing multiple projects, how do you keep up with the, you know, the documentation and everything across all of those different projects? So this is a topic that we talk about very often internally at Think Company. So I thought you may all have a very passionate response to that question.
Yeah. I don't think that there is a blanketed answer to that question because every project is a different size. So I've heard about people being on 30 projects at any given time, but they're probably spending very little time on each one of those. For us, what's important is knowing the amount of time per week that project is going to take. So that starts in the scoping of the project. We have estimating sheets that help us understand that. And then we adjust that timing weekly so that we know that it's a well-balanced week, no matter how many projects each person is on. For us, we sometimes have projects that take, you know, 20 hours a week from a project manager. So it's nice to have a balance of one core project that might take 20 hours a week and then supplement with a couple smaller ones. So maybe any project manager might be on 4 or 5 projects, depending on the size. But that estimate and knowing how much time you'll need to spend every single week is really the key to making sure that you'll have time to do everything that you're supposed to do. Repeatable, predictable meetings are really great as well. And then you'll know, these are the meetings I have for this project. This is how much time I need to dedicate to just meetings. Then I have to do these activities. So that's a way to understand how much time you might want to allocate for each project.
Yeah. And I think that I'm guessing that the person who asked that question also asked the next question that's on the list, which is, you know, if you're sharing resources or people across multiple projects, like how do you ensure that the cadence of work or the ceremonies that you're going through aren't conflicting across multiple projects, which is a challenge that we run into all the time. So I wonder if anyone has any techniques for helping to manage that.
I would kind of echo what Elina said. I think oftentimes those kinds of conflicts are sometimes unavoidable, but a lot of the time it comes down to estimates. Like if someone is truly needing to be in two places at the same time all week, there's something wrong with your estimate. So, you know, you have not accurately estimated that that person needs to spend 40 hours a week in two different places, right? So I think sometimes it's, you know, it's not an estimating problem, but on occasion it can be. So I think really being honest about the amount of time it takes to do the work, and then, you know, you're talking to a bunch of project managers here, so it's we're gonna all come back to plans and estimates, but like, I really do think that sometimes when that has happened on a project and I've been maybe an advisor on it, I've asked like, what are we underestimating the amount of time that this person needs to dedicate to the two projects they're on? And if so, let's get that accurate and then see how we resolve that conflict.
I think another component of this though is I'm not when you ask about like sharing resources across projects, yeah, do you have a platform that all the various teams can see and to see who's working on what at what time? You know, we have a resource planning tool that we use. It's a homegrown tool, nothing too elaborate, but we do have a very strict process around updating it. And the project managers are held accountable to keep it up to date as often as possible. And then we meet as a team every Friday to review. And the expectation is that most conflicts are resolved before the meeting, but then if they're not, that the meeting's a time for, you know, people to try to resolve those conflicts. But it happens every week like clockwork. Doesn't matter who's on vacation, you know, whatever, it happens.
Yeah. And I think there's some level of you know, personal responsibility that helps out too at the beginning. I know at the beginning of every project, when a project manager is trying to set up the cadence of meetings, you know, they're sitting there with a team that may have a cadence of meetings with another project they're working on, and it may take time to sort of iron all that out and find the right cadence. But then if you stick with that, then everything should fit in with each other. And again, if the estimates are right and the plan is right, then it'll all work out. I feel like we have enough time for one more question. Most of the attendees have dropped out. We're down to 17. We started with 40. So, but there's a great question here from another anonymous person. So I'm going to ask that as the last question. So COVID-19 has created this space for a lot of innovation. It's also forced some companies to adapt their products. How do you move forward on projects when you do not have when you don't have a specific customer or client, but there's still a problem to solve? And this is a design question, but I really think that our project managers are highly qualified design thinkers as well. So, you know, if we're trying to solve a problem, but we don't know who the customer or client or end user is, then you know, what do we do? How do we tackle that? Does anybody have any thoughts about that?
How do you know you have a problem?
You caught the softball question. Yes.
That's my first question. A lot of the times sorry, I have some light here, but a lot of the times we sit down and we start solutioning something, and halfway through the solution we say, well, who is this actually, like, what is the problem that we're actually solving and who is this for? Having answers to those questions are the very first things, you know, to unblock yourself, to know which direction to move forward. So I guess my question back to you is, why are you working on this to begin with if you don't know, if there is no one to solve it for?
Yeah, I think that's I kind of threw a softball out there just as you know, the designer in me wanted to get someone to, but I mean, the two terms that come to mind around this are, you know, the common term of you're building a solution in search of a problem. Which is, you know, if you can't really identify the folks who are going to be using this thing, then what are you creating? And to coin a phrase that our CEO used when we first started Think Company and would talk to our clients about, you know, we don't want to create a bunch of digital tumbleweeds out there. So if we are, and that was our response often to folks who would say like, hey, we need to build a mobile app because our competition has a mobile app. And the response to that is, you know, sometimes it costs $500,000 to $1 million to really get a comprehensive business mobile app out there. If your competition's spending $1 million to get something out there that no one's ever going to use, then you're $1 million ahead of them right now. So maybe you don't want to build that. But that's, I think, going out and validating your assumptions with the end users is a really important step in all of this. So, well, this has been a great conversation. I don't know if you have any other closing thoughts among the panel here. I think we have a massive list of ideas and resources that came out of this that are in the chat and also in a Slack channel we've been managing behind the scenes. So, Jen,
Phil? Sorry.
Yeah.
Phil, sorry. There was one question in the Q&A that I wanted to answer, and I started typing, and I figured out we have a minute around does documentation fall into waterfall methodology?
Oh yeah, go for it.
Bureaucracy, and I just want to say no. I don't think so, and I think the spirit of the early Agile manifesto and things. These were built around small teams who are looking to be fast and nimble and mostly accountable for themselves. A group of folks sitting in a garage building an app for themselves. So they're accountable for themselves, but for us, and I think many of us, we're accountable to other people, right? Somebody's asking us to produce something, and you need requirements documented to ensure that you are producing what they want, right? Now, a lot of the documentation we talked about, though, is more like reference material, right? And that's a different type of documentation, and that does not imply strict waterfall or bureaucracy. That's just, to me, it's no different than a very experienced developer who may have read 60 books on their language of choice, right? It's reference material, and the documentation that we talked about for mitigating risk and managing uncertainties really should be looked at in that spirit. Like it's for future use. It's to keep you on track during the project. It's to help make sure that you're on track after the project, to help make sure you don't make the same mistakes or that you've learned from the lessons of the past. So I don't think it goes against any sort of methodology or approach.
Those are great points. Thanks. I didn't realize that question was there. I'd scrolled past it, so it's like at the top of the questions list. But that's great. Anyone else have any other closing thoughts?
I just want to say thank you to everyone who joined, and we had fun putting it together. We hope that it was valuable and that there's at least one takeaway for the folks who joined. And if you ever want to get in touch, we're all on LinkedIn. There's going to be information about how to get in touch if you have more questions in that summary email. So
great.
Here for you.
Yeah. Okay, well, I mean, just to close it out, like Elina said, and this is posted in the chat, and it will also be in a follow-up email. There's a 2-minute survey. If you have any feedback on this, we always want to make these webinars better. And so that will be in the follow-up email, as well as a recording of this if you want to share it with your colleagues or with folks who couldn't make it. That will be a link in there, as well as some resources. If you want to chat with anyone on the panel, we do offer virtual coffee. And so there will be a link in the follow-up email to schedule something like that. If you want to hang out with Bruce, Jess, Elina, or Jen and chat for a bit after sometime in the next couple of weeks. And if you enjoyed this session, please remember to sign up for How Fast is Fast with John Young, Demystifying Website Performance. And I think that's about it. So thanks everyone for attending. Thanks everyone on the panel for a great talk.
Bye. Thank you.